We often forget that contemporary Europe was not born, as the United States was, in a euphoria of new beginnings, but in a sinking sense of its own abjection. The crimes of the Nazis affected the entire old world, like a cancer that had been growing inside it. Thus, the European victors over the Third Reich were contaminated by the enemy they had helped defeat, in contrast to the Americans and the Soviets, who emerged from the conflict crowned in glory. Ever since, all of Europe, both the East and the West, has carried the burden of Nazi guilt, as others would have us bear the guilt of North American slavery and Jim Crow. It has left us sullied to the very depths of our culture. This might be what the Martinique poet Aimé Césaire contends when he de-Germanizes Hitler and makes him the very metaphor of the white man in general. In 1955, his Discours sur le colonialisme, Césaire points to the very distinguished, very humanist, very Christian bourgeois 20th century man who, without realizing it, carries within himself a little Hitler. Hitler haunts him. Hitler is his demon. And if he rails against him, he's not being consistent. Basically, what he cannot forgive Hitler for is not his crime against men, it's his crime against the white man. It's white man's humiliation at Europe having been subjected to the colonialist practices that previously applied only to the Arabs of Algeria, the coolies of India, and the Negroes of Africa. Let us disregard for a moment the gross comparison that equates colonialism with genocide and the racializing of white people who thereby become the universal symbol of infamy, as witnessed today in the growing anti-racism movement. Not only did history provide Hitler with centuries of precedents, but he has never been anything but the true face of Europe, the Europe that confronted him even as it acquiesced in his rise to power. The amazing thing is not that such masochistic theories should flourish, but that they are applauded by so many elites. For a few decades, the Cold War delayed the West's self-examination. But since 1989 and the inclusion of ex-Soviet bloc countries into a widening European Union, the crisis of conscience has only deepened and has partially, if not completely, guided political thought. Having scaled unprecedented peaks of barbarity, the Europe of Brussels has decided to redeem itself by privileging moral values over realpolitik. Since then, we've been encouraged to adopt what Auguste Comte and Victor Hugo, each for his own reasons, called the religion of humanity, grounded in altruism and devotion. Western Europeans dislike themselves. They are unable to overcome their self-disgust and feel the pride in their heritage and the self-respect that is so strikingly evident in the United States. Modern Europe is instead mired in shame and shrouded in moralizing discourse. It has convinced itself that, since all the evils of the 20th century arose from its feverish bellicosity, it's about time it redeemed itself and sought something like a reawakened sense of the sacred in its guilty conscience. What better example of this proclivity exists than Angela Merkel's embrace of about 1 million refugees fleeing war-torn Syria in 2015? Even though this gesture that would help replenish a shrinking labour force was not strictly disinterested, for this pastor's daughter, it was also a spectacular way to repudiate Nazism and escape its shadow. After the catastrophe of the Second World War, the Federal Republic would now offer itself as an ostentatious example to the world. Germany would practice open-heartedness in a single country, just as Stalin and the USSR had once practiced socialism in a single country. Already preeminent in Europe, Berlin would call the shots, whether exercising toughness or kindness. Merciless with the Greeks in July, when the Chancellery wanted to eject them from the Eurozone, but beneficent with the Syrians in September, it could demonstrate severity or an ever so imperial charity. Thomas Aquinas, an heir to Aristotle, was the first to turn ethics of virtue into a theory. Montesquieu deplored the despotism and corruption of the French monarchy, which he compared to the virtue of ancient Romans. But he also realized that, for fragile and flawed humanity, his ideal of virtue was impossible. Rousseau would point out the difference between the good man, who is the natural man, and the virtuous man, a citizen who cares about the well-being of his compatriots. The good man is self-sufficient. The benevolent man lives in society. But both Rousseau and later Kant, who admitted that only a godlike people could govern democratically since man is by nature imperfect and corruptible. And so, after 1945, and particularly after 1989, Europe decided to interrogate its history and its geography, its past and its borders, and to construct its future on radical tolerance. Ulrich Beck's idea of vacuité substantielle, or a lack of substance, has more or less evolved from the universal patriotism of Jürgen Habermas, who prefers to draw a purely formal link among citizens. Without altogether dismissing collective identities, the German philosopher only recognizes them within a framework of constitutional principles founded on the universal rights of man. Particularly with regard to Germany, he calls for a critical look at the past. A nation, he argues, is founded less on a shared lived tradition than on a set of indisputable values. Murderous chauvinism must therefore be replaced by a postmodern national affiliation. Habermas attempts a delicate balancing act: rehabilitate sovereignty without harnessing it to a rhetoric of identity. Habermas and his contemporaries urge us to be suspicious of those traditions that led Europe into disaster. One should therefore adopt a problematized conscience regarding history that is nourished by a new interpretation of past centuries. In whatever scenario, universalism, even Hegel's concrete universalism, must win out over any local particularities. Broadly speaking, this universal patriotism has become the philosophy adopted by the Brussels Commission. It's paradoxical that, notwithstanding its massaging of public opinion, the Federal Republic of Germany, in the guise of a modest nation, became the leader of the European Union, upon which it ceaselessly imposed its will for nearly 3 decades now. It renounced military adventures and conquered through economic preeminence. The problem with virtuous theories, however, is that they often mask a desire for power or produce unintended consequences. Many people are wondering why it is only Europe that feels guilty, not only for its own past crimes, but also for the faults of others. The answer is simple. We dominated the world for 4 centuries. The empires have collapsed, but their memory remains, and this has given rise to an ever-expanding discipline: post-colonial studies. We have become the continent of the uneasy conscience and wish to show the rest of the world the face of moral law in its purity. Europe sees itself as a sacrificial offering through which the entire world can expiate its sins. It offers to assume the shame for every misfortune that befalls the planet: famine in Africa, drowning in the Mediterranean, terrorism, natural disasters. They are all directly or indirectly our handiwork. And when we are attacked by terrorists, for example, it's still our fault. We had it coming, and we are undeserving of compassion. Since we are overcome by such a torrent of sins, all we can do is bear up and attempt to correct it and atone for them all, one by one. An unctuous discourse intended to edify is replacing what was once political and historical analysis. An ideal society must replace the existing one of ordinary man and be cleansed of its impurities. 2 areas in particular reveal the delusion of sanctity: immigration and ecology.